told you it wasn't embarrassing to hear that, but it is actually embarrassing to hear that. The fact that so many people are my former students just shows how long I've been doing this, how old I am. But no, I'm really delighted to be here today to talk. I'm supposed to stand here close to the microphone a bit, to talk about some of the work that Oliver and I have been involved in for almost the last 7 years. To talk about research generally. As Oliver mentioned, I've just taken up a new role as pro-director of research at SOAS, which is a lot of sort of strategy, executive work, and admin, and not so much, it doesn't give me many opportunities to think about our own research, but it's really important that I continue to do that, so thank you for the opportunity to reflect on some of these things. And some of the ideas I'll be sharing with you today are the very raw materials, the very first kind of iterations of the opening chapter of a book that Oliver and I are working on, which tries to kind of synthesize a lot of the learning that we've been doing over the last several years, and I'll get into that in more detail. So just wanted to start off by saying something about the research and evidence facility that we've been engaged in. This is a consortium that's made up, it's led by SOAS, but the University of Manchester is a partner of that, together with Sahan Research, which is a think tank based in Nairobi in Kenya. We have, in addition to having Oliver's time and expertise, we also benefit from Rob Dobbert here and Chris Jordan in the comms team at Manchester, so it's really been a great collaboration between our institutions. And we have a team that's based largely in Nairobi as well. You'll get a glimpse of them towards the end of the presentation. So the idea of the Research and Evidence Facility was really that we're funded by the European Union Trust Fund for Africa, which was a fund established in 2015 at the end of what people will recall was coined the migration crisis. That was a crisis that was, for the most part, could be attributed mostly to a policy crisis rather than a crisis of the numbers of people on the move. About 1 million people entered the European Union during the summer of 2015, and much to the alarm of European member states. But in fact, the real crisis was the fact that the EU was caught flat-footed and didn't have a policy framework in order to be able to absorb such large numbers of people. So that was the kind of impetus that led to the establishment of the European Union Trust Fund, where member states got together and they said, people are telling us they're on the move because of a lack of development opportunities, therefore let's give them development opportunities and they'll stop moving, essentially. I'll go into the reasons that was a flawed argument, but that's not to say that it wasn't necessarily a good idea to run the European Trust Fund, or the EUTF, or as we call it, which ended up being a fund of somewhere between 2.5 to 3 billion euros. Our piece of it was very small. But be that as it may, quite a lot of money has been spent, not just in the Horn of Africa, which I'm going to talk about today, but also they have these 3 kind of windows. So there's a Horn of Africa window, a North Africa window, and a Sahel window. And our patch of it is the Horn. And 9 countries of the Horn, so Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Djibouti, Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, there we go, 9. And so we've been working since 2016 on really not so much a research project, but more it's a sort of a small research center aimed at conducting research on the dynamics around migration within the region and to some extent from the region. But we're not actually that focused on migration between the Horn of Africa and the EU. That is a tip of the iceberg. And even that 1 million, the figure of 1 million people entering the EU was only during that year, 6% of the global population of displaced people in the world. So it was, even at that time, in those large numbers, quite a tip of the iceberg. But even if we look at the region of the Horn of Africa generally, we can see that there are many more people who are on the move within the region, for the most part, going shorter distances, sometimes across international boundaries, sometimes not, so often between rural areas and urban areas. And I know Manchester has a particular interest in cities and urbanization, and we can talk about that a bit more later. But really we were looking at trying to understand the dynamics of migration and the context in which this large amount of money from the EU was being spent. Not so much to evaluate their projects, but to help better inform the ways in which their projects and their activities were being designed, to some extent looking at some of the broader effects of some of their programming, et cetera. So we're not a monitoring and evaluation function, importantly. We're also not a policy function. We tried to steer clear of much of EU policy, partly because we, to be honest, disagree with a lot of it. But we're looking at more at the broader kind of development context in which the EU is a major player in development and migration sort of policy programming in the region. So as a kind of, think of us as a research center. We've done, I think I counted on the train today, 28 different research projects so far, and we've got still more, a few more in the pipeline. We're in our last year of programming, and we'll be winding down next summer. But an essential part of the work that we've been doing has been not just to have us as a small team of 9 people carrying out this research, but to work with a broad constellation network of people across the region, most of whom are from the region, some of whom we knew about before, many of whom we've come across in the course of the last 7 years, to try to really draw on that really wealth of talent and expertise that exists within the region, and to showcase it, to show not only the EU, but other broader, wider kind of colleagues in the academic and policy worlds, that there is this strong well of expertise within the region. So we've had 2 international conferences attended by over 100 people each, in which we showcased a lot of the work of our research colleagues. And I'm really proud of the fact that the REF has been such a catalyst for research networking across the region, and something that will continue hopefully as a legacy once the REF is finished. I've put in our kind of contacts. If you're interested in knowing more, look at our website, or if you're still on Twitter, you can look at RefHorn. We haven't joined Mastodon yet, but we might do that in the future. We'll see what happens. But what I want to talk about today, having just introduced the way that the REF works. I should say one other thing about the way the REF works, because I'm going to come back to it later on. We do something that we call front-loaded advocacy, which is that when we come up with a research project, we talk to the EU about it. They're our funder. They're ultimately the people we want to influence with the research that we're doing. And so we say to them, what are the burning questions you have around youth employment, for instance? Tell us what the questions are. Tell us what would be useful to you to know. And so we talk with them about the terms of reference of that study and what it should look like. We have ultimately the kind of final say on what goes into that study, but we think that through that process of negotiation from the very early conceptualization stage, the donor will be more interested and more invested in what the final outcome of the research is. And we found that over the last 28 times that really has been the case, that there is a much more of an open kind of dialogue that's already initiated by the time the research is done, so that there's a maximized chance of having some policy impact. So that's a key kind of feature of the way that the REF works. But what I want to talk about today is not the 28 different projects we've done, but what we're trying to do now is think across the different projects that we've been doing, across the different themes, to think about what have we learned about the relationship between migration and development. What are some of it's very hard to kind of design a research project on the broad themes of migration and development. So what we did was we broke it down into constituent parts, and we looked at urbanization, climate and migration, displacement, youth employment, various other aspects of movement, and I'm going to talk about those kinds of themes today. But then breaking it down into these kind of constituent parts and enables you to kind of gather evidence on these specific themes, but then we then want to put them together again and amalgamate them and think about actually, so now let's go back to our big question, which is how do migration and development influence each other, and see what we come up with. Do we have something more intelligent or better informed to say, having gone through this long period of research? So that's what I want to talk about today. And one of the kind of key starting points of that is to think about the fact that the Horn of Africa, the broad Horn of Africa, the sort of so-called Greater Horn of Africa, has for a long time really been overly associated with the idea of displacement. People know about it because there are many refugees there. There are many refugees there. There are many internally displaced people there. There is conflict, absolutely. That's a major feature of what we look at. But that's by far, that is not the only story. And we really wanted to make sure in this research that we didn't just look at displacement, we got into other aspects of labor migration, educational migration, environmental migration, all sorts of reasons that people are on the move, and didn't make assumptions about why people are on the move, but actually made that part of the research question to really understand a bit more about why people move, what kinds of processes are they engaged in when they make those kinds of decisions, what's their experience, and what happens afterwards. So that's the first thing. And so in doing that, we really want to also think critically about development policy as it pertains to the region, and the ways in which it is often sort of problematizes mobility and migration. It's seen as a problem. So displacement, of course, is often seen as a problem because people are moved against their will. But so are other forms of mobility, often also seen as problematic. So if you look at the history of development policy in the region, you see that government after government throughout the region and throughout time has tried to institute sedentarization policies, getting pastoralists, for instance, to settle down. It's easier to govern people when they stay put, when they're not moving around with their animals, et cetera. You can have schools, you can have clinics, you can do, community-based, locality-based support for people, much more convenient. But all of those attempts to try to get people to stop moving have failed. We also see, and this goes back to some of the literature, if you think about work by Hindehas, for instance, who writes about the fact that investment in development often leads to more movement, more mobility. And a lot of the evidence that we've gathered over these years also points to that same dynamic. So the kind of second point that I want to make here is that really mobility needs to be seen as this regular, normal, often positive, or at least not problematic feature of life in the Horn of Africa, and that very often the development frameworks that we use to understand that and the policies that we base on our understanding don't take into account the common feature of mobility, the commonness of mobility, and the fact that it is a major feature of life. And I'll come back to that. So in fact, we might find that when you do a massive investment in development, such as the EUTF, that there might be more migration as a result of that. People might be trained for skills, might have new kinds of assets, and they might want to use them, and so they might move to use them. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. We just want not to make value judgments about whether or not movement is bad or not, or a problem to be solved. And so really then to think, finally I'll talk about this later on, about the need for development theory and practice to really embrace mobility more fully, which is why I changed the title of this the title of this presentation to Kicking Development into Motion, and I'll come back to why I've done that in a few minutes. So a kind of common piece of thinking that sort of motivates a lot of what we do and a lot of the way that we think is to start with the basic premise that migration is really only problematic when there's a lack of safety or a lack of choice, or when the move is forced, or when people are worse off after they moved than they were beforehand. Then that becomes problematic. But that is a subset of quite a lot of the reasons that people are on the move. And that sometimes the problematic nature of that's associated with migration and mobility is more often about the ways in which governments, brokers, neighbors, and aid agencies can intervene in the lives of migrants, blocking their ability to be resilient and to meet the objectives of the movement. So the problem becomes the disruption of the process of movement rather than the movement itself. And so then we have things like externalization of borders, pushbacks, forced returns, relocations, moving people not now thinking outside of the box of the Horn of Africa, but moving people to places like Rwanda, et cetera. The problem then becomes the policy response rather than the actual movement of people in and of itself. And the criminalization of migrants comes along with that very often, not just, of course, in thinking of it in the UK context, but in the Horn of Africa context, this happens as well, that migrants themselves are seen as being problematic, sometimes being seen as criminals, sometimes their movement is seen as illegal. And then there's a refusal to recognize the kind of rights and the protection needs that people on the move have. And those undermine what would be otherwise perhaps positive aspects of migration. So I said at the beginning that we kind of took our thinking, we had this broad question around how are migration and development interrelated. And we thought you can't actually answer that question in a big sort of as a whole. It's better to kind of break that down. one of the key components of breaking that down was to look at some of the questions of what happens when you have an intervention perhaps that engages in the fact of unemployment or the fact of lack of economic opportunity. If the intervention is aimed at providing people with opportunity, can we look at whether or not that has any influence on people's movement as a piece of that movement? So Oliver was kind of led on this work. In fact, Oliver should be giving this part of the lecture. We could have done this jointly. Where we looked at the impact of technical and vocational training on people's thoughts about migration. We weren't evaluating the project itself, did it work or not, but what we did is interview people before, during, and after their engagement in this kind of training to see what difference did it make in terms of people's thinking about movement. And perhaps not surprisingly to a group like this, we found that lots of people wanted to take the skills they learned in their courses and move. So if you took that final that kind of judgment or that finding and went back to the funder and said, well, you had this vocational training program, you instituted it because people said they were moving because they had no jobs, you gave them the possibility of having jobs, but they're still moving. Does that mean that the intervention itself was a failure? We said, no, it wasn't necessarily a failure, but we think that you're asking the wrong question, and that's kind of where we come in. We kind of try to change people's ways of evaluating their work and to change their understanding of what the relevance, what's the broader dynamics within which their projects are being carried out. And so we said, you know, if more people are moving after having benefited from this technical and vocational training, that might actually be a success story because now they have something to move with. They have more choice, they can decide where they want to go, they can have the possibility of having a job. Many of the people who Oliver and colleagues interviewed said they did want to move, but they didn't have an ambition to move long distances. They weren't looking to leave the region of the Horn of Africa. They were looking to go to the nearest city, to the capital city, maybe to cross an international border to the next city that's in the next country next door. But it was really quite localized. They might ultimately do that. They might move from northern Uganda to Kampala and then after a while decide that they want to go further on. But the hope is, and the plan would be, that they would do that only once they'd kind of saved up enough to be able to travel probably more safely, probably under more regular conditions, than and thereby avoid the riskiness, the problematic aspect of migration, which is to subject oneself to to brokers and traffickers and others who offer services to move you, but at quite high risks. So there's not necessarily a negative story in here, even though we have many more people on the move as a result. That's kind of one example of how we broke apart the migration and development question. Another place in which we did that was to do a series of different studies looking at the relationships between climate, migration, and mobility. And part of underlying that piece of work was a nagging feeling that the narratives about why people are on the move are often misinformed. They're often quite sensationalist kind of headlines about hordes of people on the move, flows of people on the move across long distances, that somehow the climate emergency presents a major threat, for instance, of people from the Horn of Africa moving to Europe, which is not what's happened. People who move to Europe from the region of the Horn of Africa tend to be quite well educated, quite middle class, often to have quite decent resources, relatively speaking. And people who are displaced as a result of climate change tend to be people who moved at the end, once they've exhausted all of their coping strategies. They may be pastoralists who've lost their herds and they are moving now really often quite out of desperation to the nearest possible place where they can find to be able to support themselves, with the hope that as soon as, now we have a major drought going on within the Horn of Africa region, that as soon as the drought has passed, they'll be able to go back to their homes. Often that's not possible, and they remain displaced, particularly in urban centers or peripheral urban centers for many years. That then becomes problematic. But we wanted to kind of correct the narratives around why people are on the move. So early on in our work, for instance, there was a drought in 2017, and we looked at the data on people leaving the region. We looked at whether or not there were more people crossing the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden going towards Yemen and Saudi Arabia, which is a very well-established historical route by which people leave the region. And we found that there was not actually much increase in the people leaving the region. But there was quite a lot of increase in urban centers, in people moving into the big cities, particularly in Somali areas, but also in some others. And to some extent, moving into refugee camps. There was that kind of movement, but that, again, was more localized, intra-regional movement. So that's a kind of corrective, in a sense, to the popular narratives. And those popular narratives, unfortunately, underlie and influence quite a lot of policy around climate and mobility. So several of the pieces that we've done, looking at kind of the development of green economy policy in Walaita in Ethiopia, looking at resilience and local understandings of resilience in Turkana in northern Kenya, understanding the relationships between people moving into urban spaces and the connections they maintain with rural places in Laikipia in Kenya. Those are just a few examples. We also did some city studies in Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia, looking at movement between rural and urban places. And all of that kind of helped us to come up to, now we're trying to kind of put the thinking across all those different projects together and think, what did we learn from that? One of the things we clearly found in all of that work is that very often climate and migration policy are conducted in silos. There it is, I know now we've just come out of COP27, very little conversations in Sharm el-Sheikh were had about migration and the impact of migration. There was actually a working group on African cities that fed into COP27, which is an improvement over COP26, in which the word migration was virtually never spoken. The focus on a lot of climate policy is on the technical aspects of, carbon emissions, of lowering greenhouse gases, of lowering global warming, not so much on the human impacts of how people respond to climate change, to environmental change, which is surprising in a place like the Horn of Africa, because the main way in which people respond and adapt to the changing environment is largely through movement, right? They're moving to the nearest town, they're changing their migration, their pastoral, seasonal migration patterns, a whole variety of different ways of adaptation, but those are not really considered they're considered by social scientists, but they're not so much considered by people who are dealing with climate yet. And so when we talk to our colleagues in the EU who are developing a 7-year policy on climate in the region, and we said, what are you doing on migration? They said, well, the migration people are over here. We're the climate people. And we're, why are you guys not talking to each other? Why are you not understanding the way that climate change, as it's the lived experience of climate change in the region, is really about movement, mobility of some form or other. So we've been kind of chipping away at that, trying to get more conversations happening, with some success. I think that there's much more kind of engagement and understanding of these interrelationships now. And as I said, what we see is that movement is often across these short distances. It's also, yes, it is an urbanization story, and I'll get to that in a second. But it's also very much we also want to try to unpick this idea of movement into cities. It's not just about people forsaking rural areas and rural social networks and moving into cities and becoming entirely urban dwellers, but very often there's a sharing and a continued negotiation and linkages to people who remain in the countryside. And so that piece, for instance, on Laikipia in Kenya was written by one of our colleagues on the team, who also is a PhD student of mine, Caitlin Sturridge, who is looking at these kind of the ways in which livelihoods are stretched between rural and urban places and maintain the characteristics of both. They're not fully urban, they're not fully rural, but they move back and forth between those. And it kind of, again, challenges some of the language that we use in so-called rural studies or urban studies, which seems to kind of stovepipe people into one thing or the other. So just to make the historical point that in the region you can see incredible urbanization that's gone on over the last 70 years, and I would argue that quite a lot of that is sparked by the increased impacts of climate change, and increasing numbers of people who are, well, it's climate change, it's also a demographic change. There are many more young people within the continent. looking for education, looking for jobs, and therefore moving into towns and cities. So you can definitely unpick what the different drivers of that are. But we're really kind of quite keenly interested in those relationships. One of the key features of urbanization in the region, as many of you will know, is that it's not just people moving to the biggest cities. It's the largest, globally speaking, the largest pattern of urbanization is people moving to secondary cities, and the cities which might be provincial capitals or second cities within countries. And so we've spent a lot of time in the REF looking at so-called secondary cities, so places like Dirdawa in Ethiopia, Eldoret in Kenya, Baidoa in Somalia, Kismayo in Somalia, Hargeisa as well, in Somaliland, which is a kind of smaller size of city. So trying to understand these different kinds of dynamics. Just to make a point about Somalia and the shifting nature of the urban population, it's anticipated that by 2026 there'll be more people living in urban centers of some sort, not only in the capital city, but in some kinds of urban settings than in rural areas. And that's a major challenge, particularly in a place like Somalia, which has been affected by conflict and repeated drought and has such poor, weak infrastructure, governance infrastructure, funding infrastructure and physical infrastructure to be able to adapt to these movements, resulting in very large numbers of people who are living as internally displaced people. So there are problematic aspects of some of this migration, but again, maybe the problematic aspect of quite a lot of it has to do with the inability to actually respond effectively to the fact of people on the move, in a sense, rather than people being on the move. So we might think about things in a slightly different way in that way. I started off at the beginning, I said, that there's a lot of over-focus, sort of disproportionate focus on displacement in the region. And of course there is a lot of displacement within the region. There are kind of, we sort of thought about this, rather than thinking about it from a national perspective, we were thinking about kind of the conflict complexes that exist within the region and trying to understand how those then lead and link to displacement. So obviously over the last 30 years there's been the displacement of Somalis within the country as well as outside to neighboring countries, to Ethiopia and Kenya in particular. That's one kind of conflict constellation that's led to displacement. The South Sudan conflict is another one, which has gone on for many, many years, and now has a major displacement both within South Sudan as well as in the neighboring countries. And we're just now finishing up a massive study that we did looking at displacement and return in South Sudan as well as with South Sudanese in Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia, trying to understand what people's concerns are about the possibilities of return and the experiences of return for those who have come, because over the years many have come back, left again, come back again, to try to inform the policy process which is now ongoing within the region of trying to think about returns and what those should look like and how support for return what that might look like. So trying to look at these different kind of constellations. But one of the pieces that comes out when you look at displacement across the region is the idea that, a couple of different things. One is that displacement is often seen as a security issue or an internal affairs issue, not so much as a development issue. So the development people who deal at the national level in countries and also within the international community often are very different from the people who work with displacement and refugees. In the UN system, you have UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Organization for Migration who deal with migrants, and the UN Development Program and other UN agencies often deal with the development questions. And there's not a lot of collaboration between the two. When I worked in Somaliland back in 1998, I was originally brought there to work for UNDP to try to get them to talk to UNHCR about a shared process for returning refugees from Ethiopia. And I gave up on that after about 3 months and said, look, either I'm going back to the US and finishing my PhD, or I will work for the Ministry of Planning and just do that, because that looks like a lot more satisfying of a job than trying to get UN agencies talking to each other. And then recently did a piece of work for UNDP and found that actually the discussion hasn't really changed much in 25 years. It's still very nascent. It's still, there's a lot of gap between there. So even between those kinds of organizations. So this just leads to the idea of stovepiped approaches to understanding displacement, not really integrating with development policy or thinking. And also that on one side. And then the second kind of problem that exists within policy on displacement tends to be the fact that these so-called durable solutions are not very creatively framed, and they often don't really follow what people are actually doing with their lives. So the durable solutions, anyone who's studied migration will know they're, tell me what they are, somebody. What are the 3 durable solutions? Anyone? Anyone studying migration here? They are. I think so. Oliver's got some. You haven't heard of it? All right. Shall I help you out? Anybody? I saw you half raise your hand. No. Okay. All right. The 3 durable solutions are repatriation, local integration, or resettlement. Those are the 3 prescribed ones, right? So each of them is about take the person and put them in a place. Put them back where they came from. Let them stay where they are, but they should stay where they are, or put them in a 3rd place, right? None of that is mobility oriented. None of it's about people moving back and forth between different areas. And when you look at the strategies that refugees take in the Horn of Africa, so I've been working with Somali refugees for a long, long time, they're constantly on the move. They're mixing, they're spreading themselves out. They have some relatives in Nairobi, some are in the Dadaab camp, some have gone back to Somalia, and they're moving all the time, and they're managing the opportunities and the risks that are presented to try to support themselves and to be able to make ends meet, but also to make sure that when there's a crisis, they can shift themselves to another place. So movement is a central part of how people respond. Yet movement is not at all reflected in the durable solutions we use to talk about displacement. So there's a need to think more broadly and more creatively about durable solutions and what could happen, which again is why we're kind of moving now towards thinking about kind of what does all of this mean for development. So here we are, development policy. So kind of our takeaways from all of this work that we've been doing over the last several years has been that we really have started to understand, to unpick development policy, try to understand where the gaps are, where it's not meeting the lives and the experiences of those who are on the move. And you can see that within development policy, there are a couple of biases. One is that it's very sedentary, and that's not a new notion. Lisa Malky wrote about that in the 1990s. Many people have since then. But really kind of focusing on the idea that it's more convenient and easier and preferable for people to stay put and then be kind of developed, if you like, or to be subjected to development policy through their, once they've settled down. And that when they're on the move, that's not really a development question. It might be a humanitarian question, it might be something else, but development policy doesn't really engage well with mobile populations. And also that it's very exclusionist. So if you think about the Sustainable Development Goals, which are about leave no one behind, or the underlying logic of something called the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, which was agreed in the 2016 at the UN General Assembly and has now resulted in refugee policies in many, many countries around the world, including several in this region. The language of the Sustainable Development Goals and the CRRF are about leave no one behind, be inclusive, et cetera. But when you look at real development policy, often they are extremely exclusionist. They don't include, I'm not sure exclusionist is a word, but anyway, they exclude people from, people who are on the move are by definition kind of written out of that. So you have a situation, to give an example, most national development policies are quite separate from migration policies. They might have different ministries dealing with them. They don't really mention each other. So you have a national development plan and you have a national plan for refugees, returnees, and IDPs, and they don't really speak to each other. An exception for that is actually Somalia, which is I think the only country now in the region that has in its national development plan an explicit engagement with refugees, returnees, and IDPs as part of its overall development focus. Most other countries don't do that. They keep the displacement issues quite siloed, and they really say virtually nothing about labor migration, for instance. often migration sits, as I said, within a different ministry. So in Kenya, for instance, it sits within the Ministry of Home Affairs. In Ethiopia, it's in the Ministry of Internal Affairs. It's often seen as a security issue rather than a development issue. So those are some real problems. I already talked about how development policy tries to settle people down, but really this kind of problem here where there's a crisis in the way that we think about development and the ways that it kind of excludes the fact that people are on the move. When you do have refugee policy within national governments, we find that very often, even if you have one of these three durable solutions, they're often sort of not complete solutions. So there might be possibilities for people to so-called integrate locally or to stay for an indefinite period of time within a country, but there's no pathway for them to achieve full citizenship, for instance. So they may not be able to own property, they may not be able to have full employment benefits, they may not be able to benefit from all the same social services that local people, citizens are able to enjoy, they may not be able to vote, etc. So the pathways to citizenship are really problematic. Sometimes, in many countries within the region, there's an attempt to try to keep people from moving. So Kenya is an example where refugees are required to stay within the refugee camps and not to move. They have to have authorization if they want to leave the camps, which creates a kind of catch-22 situation. So if somebody wanted to find a job outside the camp, the employer says, come to us when you have your mobility pass, and the mobility pass is not available if you haven't got the offer of employment, and so it kind of goes around and around and around, and it never finishes. And when you try to critique that with government, they say, oh, but we have the right to mobility and we have the right to employment, but they don't match up. And so the question, we did one piece of work, which is where this image comes from. We were looking at pathways to mobility and employment for refugees in Kenya. And we found that virtually no one actually gets the permits and passes that, in theory, they're entitled to, because it's too complicated. They don't understand the process. In fact, it's impossible to actually kind of navigate the process to be able to get these things, even though they exist in paper. So those are kind of issues. And that's a major problem, because if you have thousands of people living in refugee camps, for instance, you can't possibly hope to achieve, they can't all achieve self-sustainability or self-sufficiency living in that kind of an environment. The community itself, there's so little economic resource circulating within the community that it's not realistic to expect that you could have a situation in which a refugee camp environment becomes self-sustaining as an economic kind of community. So there has to be mobility, there has to be movement. And there's a lot of money that's spent within refugee camps on creating cottage industries, creating employment opportunities, with the idea that the market itself is the refugee population itself, so it doesn't work. So a lot of our research has been focusing on that aspect. So where does that take us now in terms of thinking about the policy? I'm just going to finish up by talking about the policy and the kind of academic implications of what we've been looking at. I mentioned already the SDGs and the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, having this inclusive approach that isn't really seen. One thing to say is that it's not all of the work that we've done over the last 7 years hasn't all been critical. Yes, we've been critical to some extent of processes that we've seen, but we've also seen some successes. And one of them that I wanted to highlight is the work of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, which is an association of 8 of the member states. It has 8 member states, so it's all the countries that we work in minus Tanzania, but we actually never did much work in Tanzania, so it's the region we work in. And IGAD has been leading a really important political process of trying to keep mobility issues broadly, not just refugee issues, but mobility issues high on the political agenda of its member states. And it's able to do that because it carries quite a lot of political clout. So the executive director of IGAD is the former foreign minister of Ethiopia. They're able to get heads of state to come together and commit themselves politically to a process of opening up opportunity for people on the move, whether that's refugees or a free border, a free movement policy that's being worked on within the region. And that's something that really, one could argue, could only be done by an organization like IGAD. The UN can't ensure that governments within the region all sign up to something like that. It had to come from within the region, and there has been quite a lot of, maybe we call it political peer pressure, maybe we also call it learning from the experience of one's neighbors. So within the region, for instance, you have Uganda, which has had a much more liberal policy, not entirely perfect, but a more liberal policy towards refugee hosting for many years. And that wider approach towards hosting has certainly rubbed off a bit on their neighbor, Kenya, which has had one of the most restrictive policies until recently. So last year, a new Refugee Act was passed, which does provide quite a bit more flexibility, more accommodation for refugees. It's still far from perfect, but there has been some learning that's taken place. Another example of positive development has been with Djibouti, so tiny country, but Djibouti has historically had a lot of refugees coming through its territory, mostly Ethiopians and Somalis. Some of them on their way to Yemen and Saudi Arabia, and Djibouti's position for a long time was these people are on their way somewhere else, they're not staying here, so we really have no obligation to make any services available for them except basic temporary services. And in fact, many people find that they get stuck in Djibouti. They run out of money, for whatever reason they don't move onwards, so they do remain for a long time in the country. And Djibouti has had some quite significant changes to its refugee education policy so that they now provide pretty comprehensive education in French, English, and Somali to refugees there. So that's something that one probably wouldn't have expected would have happened, and I think it has quite a large amount to do with the mobilization and the kind of advocacy that IGAD's been able to support. So that's been really great to see, and it's been something that we've worked a lot with IGAD to try to help share that success story across the region. Shifting finally into thinking about what does this say for us, all of us who are students, scholars, people who are interested in development studies. And that's why I come back to the title of the talk, which is really about trying to kick development studies into motion. There have been other attempts to try to talk about the need to set not just development studies, but social sciences more broadly into motion. So think about John Urey's thinking, and there was a sort of community of people coming out of Lancaster that have been talking about mobilities and social sciences and needing to look much more in a more concentrated or a more comprehensive manner at the fact that people are on the move. That's really true, but it's very clear that development studies, generally as an area, as a discipline, and as something linked to policy, kind of still has resisted a real embracing of the idea that people are on the move. It needs to be much more self-critical and understand where it contributes to that sedentarization that we see in the policy world. We need to figure out where our own intellectual frameworks kind of get in the way or obstruct us from thinking about how more positive forms of mobility and the strategies of people on the move that can block people and prevent them from making the most of what kinds of resources they have. We might think about as well where some of the application of our thinking about development might actually expose people to certain kinds of risk that they might not otherwise be faced with. So, the notion that people should be located in a particular locality and that movement is somehow negative can feed into this idea of the criminalization or the victimization of people on the move to their detriment in terms of protection risks. And as kind of thinkers around these issues, we need to be clear about where we might be inadvertently contributing to that kind of worsening of risk. And I think finally, just to say that I think we need a more creative way of thinking about ways of fostering and more productive movement, to think about ways in which through our development studies, thinking, writing, reading, teaching, we can engage more broadly with the positive aspects of migration and mobility, and think about ways in which rights and entitlements can be enhanced through movement rather than weakened. and therefore thinking more creatively as well about kind of durable solutions. Just to think about finally the final lessons that we've learned from the REF. I think some takeaways that we've had from this have been, one is that this long-term study of migration and development is really important, and that it's been it was a kind of a risk that the EU took in giving us this 7-year contract with about 6 million euros to, in the end, we had, about that much, to try to figure out, to think more broadly about the context in which migration happens. And it was, I think that they feel and we feel that it was a risk worth taking and that there were a lot of benefits to be had from it. So important, and now they're trying to think about how could they take the structure of the REF and incorporate it into other kinds of aspects of their planning outside of the European Union Trust Fund, the Emergency Trust Fund. Another kind of piece of lesson learned in a sense is that this way of working, as I said, with a decentralized way of working with experts from across the region has been really valuable at not strengthening their capacities in some ways, but also, more importantly, probably shining a light on their capacities and letting people in the region know much more about the kinds of expertise that exists sometimes right in their own city where they've been working. When we started off, we had this series of roundtables where we brought researchers and policy people together, and after every single one, whether it was in Kampala or Hargeisa or Addis Ababa or Nairobi, people said, oh, I didn't know that so-and-so lived in this city, and we're like, you live here, we don't live here. You should be in touch with each other, and hopefully that's a dynamic that continues on, that doesn't depend on us as the REF to keep it going, but people now know each other and they're going to each other much more, and I hope that that opens up much broader conversations. This questions around breaking down the big questions of migration and development was a kind of an experiment to say, let's take the big question, break it down, figure out, gather evidence about it, and then try to put it all together again, and that's where we are now. I think that that's been a useful exercise. We'll see how articulate we are when we finally write this book, and you can decide too. But that's been a useful approach. And then finally, this notion of the way that we work in terms of front-loaded advocacy, of working with those who we want to influence through our research from the very beginning, and doing what we might think of as co-produced research, really has yielded quite useful impacts and could potentially be a model that's used in other contexts as well. So I'd be happy to hear of what any of you think about that. This is our team. You might notice a couple of familiar faces there. Oliver, Chris Jordan, who is not here today, unfortunately, because he's not feeling well, but it's been great to work with Manchester on this project, and with our team in Nairobi based as well. So with that, I would welcome any comments, questions, criticisms, etc. Thank you.